So, I don't know if you've heard, but there are now over 1,000 Pokémon. How insane is that? When I started playing Pokémon, Diamond and Pearl had just released and there were 493 Pokémon. Now we're over double that, and I just honestly can't believe it. Keeping track of how many Pokémon there are is actually fairly easy, because each Pokémon is assigned its own number in the Pokédex. These numbers can sort of be seen to correlate to when the Pokémon was introduced and how early you can find them in their introduction game, although it can at times just be grouped into certain categories, like having the legendaries at the very end of a regional Pokédex, and sometimes it's completely arbitrary. Why is Magikarp so late in the Kanto Dex when it's the most common thing to reel in when fishing? These numbers are essentially lore and will seemingly never change, even though there's a lot of good reasons to. Nidoran, for example, is canonically one species, yet they will never merge the male and female versions together. Many Pokemon like Dunsparce, Roselia, and even Pikachu have received evolutions or pre-evolutions, and yet those will always have a massive chasm between them. Heck, Primeape is number 57 and its evolution, Annihilape, is number 979. That's a difference of over 900. And many have suggested ways you could give the Pokédex more logical order, but at this point, would we really want that? The Pokédex is messy, but it's been a staple for so long that I would never really want to see it change. Now, as a mathematician, I find it really interesting when a group of things is assigned specific numbers, and I find it also really interesting to consider what significant values can be passed from that. I'm not the first person to consider the idea of combining prime numbers with Pokédex numbers. In fact, the idea for this video came from a video I saw by Adef, a video I would definitely recommend you watch, but I just kind of find the idea of prime numbers cool. Wait, you don't know what a prime number is? Well, allow me to educate you. If you understand what a prime number is, I would recommend skipping ahead a bit in this video until it becomes a bit more Pokemon related.
A lot of people define a prime number as a number that can only be divided by 1 and itself, and that's basically true, but it leaves out some key details and creates a little ambiguity about that number. So let's clarify. My personal definition is always that a prime number is a number that has exactly 2 integer factors. An integer just means a whole number, so numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on would all be examples of integers, including negative numbers or the number 0. However, non-integers are numbers that aren't whole numbers, especially decimals. So for example, 1.5 or 18.76 or even pi are examples of non-integers. A factor, meanwhile, is, put simply, any whole number that another number can be divided by. Take, for example, the number 6. 6 can be divided by 2 to give you an answer of 3. And this means that 2 is a factor of 6. Similarly, 6 can be divided by 3 to give an answer of 2. And this means that 3 is also a factor of 6. 6 has 2 more factors, 1 and 6, as again, if you divide 6 by each of these numbers, you would get a whole number. If I were to instead divide 6 by 4, I would get an answer of 1.5. This is not a whole number, which means that 4 cannot be a factor of 6. Similarly, if I did 6 divided by 5, I would get 1.2. Yet again, you would not have a whole number, and therefore 5 cannot be a factor of 6. If I were to try and divide 6 by any number that is higher than 6, I would also not get a whole number. Therefore, no number higher than 6 can be a factor of 6. As a result of this, we can say that the only factors of 6 are 2, 3, 1, and 6. So let's apply this to my definition of primes, a number that has exactly 2 integer factors. That means it can only have 2 numbers which divide it to give a whole number. And this is where the usual definition people use works quite well, as every single number can be divided by both 1 and itself. 6 was able to be divided by both of these numbers, but what stops it from being prime is the fact that it has 2 other factors, 2 and 3. so it doesn't have exactly 2 factors and therefore it can't be prime. The reason I have a different definition is because of the number 1. Because clearly 1 can be divided by 1 to give a whole number, and 1 can also be divided by itself to give a whole number, so surely it's prime. But let's apply my definition. A number with exactly 2 integer factors. Well, no, 1 doesn't have that because its only factor is itself. This might seem a bit of a pedantic way to exclude 1 from being prime, but it doesn't share the crucial features that all primes have. And besides, prime numbers have actual genuine real-life applications in terms of encryption for private messaging, which the number 1 is completely useless for. Don't ask me to explain that, as it's been way too long since I studied it at university, and it's also not what we're talking about today. But all I'm going to say is that it's such an important thing that if you discover a new prime number, you stand to make a lot of money. What is relevant though, and another reason that 1 just doesn't fit with primes, is the idea of prime factorization. Because, you see, one of the fun things you can do with prime numbers is to write any number by just multiplying together prime numbers. The word product in maths just means the result when you multiply numbers together. So a number expressed as a product of its prime factors means that prime numbers will multiply together to make this number. Let's look again at the number 6. We know that the factors of 6 are 1, 2, 3, and 6. However, we also know that 6 and 1 are not actually prime numbers. That means that 6's prime factors are 2 and 3. So, to represent 6 as a product of its prime factors, you could write it as 2 times 3. You can also sometimes have more than 2 numbers in this. So, for example, the number 30. If we were to write that as a product of its prime factors, it would be 2 times 3 times 5. There are, however, sometimes more complicated examples. What if, for example, we were to look at the number 12? Well, what are the factors of 12? The factors would be, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. However, not all of these are primes, and through that, we can eliminate 1, 4, 6, and 12, as none of those are prime numbers, and that leaves us with just 2 and 3. Now, if we were to try and represent this as a product of prime factors, what some people might do is 2 times 3, because that is a product of the prime factors. However, 2 times 3 does not equal 12. We've already established that that equals 6. Instead, what we need to do is we actually need to do 2 times 2 times 3. So we're multiplying an extra 2, and that would give us 12. Now, one of the things we can do here, instead of writing out every single factor, is we can write it as 2 squared times 3. As 2 squared is just a shorter way of saying 2 times 2. Every number can be expressed as a product of its prime factors, and each one is unique.
So, now that the learning for the day is done, how does Pokémon factor into this? Well, as I said previously, each Pokémon has a number assigned to it courtesy of the Pokédex, and some of these are prime numbers. Now, I've already mentioned the ADEF video, and I would still definitely recommend you go and watch that, because he goes into much more detail about some of the specifics and also some of the weird quirks when it comes to prime numbers and Pokemon. But I wanted to zone in on something a little more specific. If you were to represent each Pokemon's Pokedex number as a product of its prime factors, and then reassigned Pokemon to those prime factors, what would each Pokemon's prime factor Pokemon be?
So, for example, Charizard. Charizard has a Pokedex number of our good old buddy 6, and we already know that the primes of 6 are 2 and 3. 2 is the Pokédex number of Ivysaur. And 3 is the Pokédex number of Venusaur. Therefore, if you were to represent Charizard as a product of its primes, the Pokemon you would have are Ivysaur and Venusaur.
On its own, I think this is a really cool idea to just think about, but I think there's something even cooler you can do with it. After all we're really doing is we're grouping together a bunch of Pokemon, and isn't that just the same as creating a Pokemon team? You could get a random number generator, generate a random number, figure out the prime factors of that number, and then do a playthrough with the Pokemon the number is assigned to, as well as its prime factors. Or you could choose your own favourite Pokemon, and then do a playthrough with that, and its prime factors. There's so many different ways you could do this, although, fair warning, you have just under a 50% chance of having Ivysaur on your team. I spent a lot of time going through every Pokemon and figuring out what their prime factor Pokemon would be. I organised it all in a spreadsheet, which I'll be putting in the video description so that you can have a look for yourself, but I wanted to talk about some of the more interesting combinations that came up as I went through this. So join me as we explore Pokemon as a product of their prime factors. So firstly, the Bulbasaur line is super interesting. Obviously, the elephant in the room is what the heck we do with Bulbasaur. As I said, Bulbasaur is not a prime number, but it also can't be written as a product of prime factors because its only factor isn't prime. Well, I think it's fair to say for the purposes of this that we'll just represent Bulbasaur on its own. It may not be prime, but one is just kinda on its own, so I think it works. Then we have Ivysaur and Venusaur, both of which have prime number Pokédex numbers and thus would also have a prime factor party of only themselves. This is, incidentally, the only entire evolutionary line that does not have any other Pokemon in its prime factor parties other than single stage Pokemon. In fact, it's one of only 3 Pokemon lines to actually have multiple members as prime factors. The other 2 lines being the Nidoran female line, where Nidoran female and Nido queen both have prime Pokédex numbers, and the Slowpoke line, where both Slowpoke and Slowking are prime numbers. Slowpoke and Slowking are obviously the only time this happens with Pokemon not with each other in the Pokédex, which actually surprised me. I kinda expected that to happen more often. But back to Bulbasaur and Venusaur. These guys will pop up a lot elsewhere, but especially Ivysaur. 2 is the only prime number that's even, and this means that Ivysaur will appear on the prime parties of every single even-numbered Pokemon, and often multiple times. In fact, there are entire parties that will be filled with nothing but Ivysaur, plus the actual Pokemon they act as the team for. So let's look at all of these Ivysaur-only teams. Obviously Ivysaur has itself on its prime team, but Charmander would have 2 Ivysaur with it, as its Pokédex number is 4, which can be written as 2 times 2 or 2 squared. Then you'd go to 8, which is 2 cubed, and this belongs to Wartortle, who would be joined by 3 Ivysaur. Next is number 16, which is 2 to the power of 4, and this is for Pidgey. To figure out what the next example of this would be, you just have to double the previous Ivysaur only team. So if Pidgey is number 16, the next one would be double that, which is 32, and this Pokemon is Nidoran male, who gets joined by 5 Ivysaur. This is also the first time in the list that we'll see a full team of Pokemon, although it does require Ivysaur, and in fact, every full team in this list has to have an Ivysaur or a Venusaur with it. This is because the next prime, Charmeleon on 5, would surpass 1025 by quite a way if you multiplied it by itself 5 times, and that would be needed to fill a whole party, and so it's impossible to have a full party that doesn't have Ivysaur or Venusaur in it. The next Ivysaur prime party would be Kadabra on 64, which would have 6 different Ivysaur, and this means that you could have a full party of Ivysaur plus a spare in the box, just in case you think that there are 6 unique Ivysaur setups you can create and want to swap them all in at different points in your playthrough. Let's do a lightning round of the remaining ones. Tauros gets access to 7 Ivysaur, and we skip Gen 2 entirely to instead go to Combuskin, who would have 8 Ivysaur. The numbers get pretty big from here, but Simisage ensures that a mono grass run is possible with its 9 Ivysaur. And finally, Terrapagos gets a whopping 10 Ivysaur. Who would ever need 10 Ivysaur? I don't know, but I guess it's an option. I think it's cool that the last of the Ivysaur teams is actually the penultimate Pokemon in the franchise. Moving away from Ivysaur for a second, I found it really interesting to think about the idea of one of these teams where all the Pokemon are fully evolved, i.e. a team that actually feels like an almost regular usable team. And at first I thought I figured that this would happen quite a lot, but I was actually surprised to find that no, it's really quite rare. The reason for this is that by some absolute fluke, almost none of the early prime numbers are assigned to fully evolved Pokemon. Like, sure, Venusaur is number 3 and that's fully evolved, but then what else is there? The next prime Pokemon are Charmeleon, Squirtle, Metapod, Weedle, Pidgeotto, Rattata, Ekans, Nidoran female. None of these are fully evolved. It's only when you come to Nidoqueen that you finally find another fully evolved Pokemon. But this is realistically quite late for a fully evolved Pokemon if we're thinking about it also being on its own team. In fact, to have a team with only fully evolved Pokemon, it is almost entirely necessary that it includes Venusaur. After all, Venusaur represents 3, so all it would take is for 3 to be multiplied by another number that is assigned to a fully evolved Pokemon, and for that product to be a number that is also a fully evolved Pokemon. This happens a few times. If you go all the way up to Kabutops, you would have a team including Venusaur and Parasect, so that's something. I won't go through all of them, but you can have teams such as Magcargo, Venusaur and Tentacruel, Wailord, Venusaur and Hitmonchan, Pyukumuku, Venusaur and Blaziken, and Bellibolt, Venusaur and Volbeat, which is actually the final of this specific type of team. I would also include Lugia, Venusaur and Farfetch'd, as Cantonian Farfetch'd is technically a fully evolved Pokemon, but it feels disingenuous to claim that when Sirfetch'd exists. Of course, you don't have to have all unique Pokemon for it to be a team of fully evolved Pokemon still, and in this regard, Venusaur has you covered too. Firstly, you could have a fully evolved team with Blastoise, as its Pokédex number is 9 and the prime factors of 9 are 3 and 3, which obviously means 2 Venusaur. But you can keep multiplying by 3 to get more teams to use, just like we did for Ivysaur. If we multiply 9 by 3, we get 27, which is Sandshrew, but that isn't fully evolved. We can keep going of course, but Magnemite is a bust. It's only when you get to Raikou that you can finally get another of these fully evolved teams, and it would have 5 Venusaur. And seeing as Brionne is the final Pokemon that would have a full team of Venusaur with it, Raikou is officially the only Pokemon capable of having a fully evolved team of 6 Pokemon. There are some other options for teams that have some more variety. For example, Gastrodon would be able to use 2 Venusaur and a Parasect. However, despite all this, the final team that can have all fully evolved Pokemon doesn't have Venusaur on it. 31 times 31 gives you 961, which is Wugtrio, and as 31 is represented by Nidoqueen, this means that this is the only team of fully evolved Pokemon that does not include Venusaur. I thought that was really cool, honestly. So we've talked about teams with only fully evolved Pokemon, and teams with only unique fully evolved Pokemon. What if we wanted to focus on the unique part rather than the fully evolved part? Well, as it happens, there are no teams that have 6 unique Pokemon on them, as this would require multiplying 5 primes together, and 2 times 3 times 5 times 7 times 11 is 2,310, which we are a long way off of. There are, however, some teams with 5 unique Pokemon on them, as multiplying 4 primes together is much more manageable. The first to do this is Granbull with Ivysaur, Venusaur, Charmeleon and Squirtle, and the last is Revavroom with Ivysaur, Venusaur, Squirtle and Ekans. I think these are some of the more interesting ones from a perspective of trying to actually make a team. Ivysaur spam or just having 1 or 2 Pokemon isn't super intriguing to me, but these teams that actually have different Pokemon feel like they could be interesting to run, especially the ones where you have to cap yourself to lower evolution stages. Another thing I was interested in was the idea of Pokemon on the same evolutionary line that could appear in the same teams. This was exceedingly rare. Kinda. Okay, so the Bulbasaur line appears quite a lot. Basically on every multiple of 6 you have to have both Venusaur and Ivysaur. Other than that, it's actually really tricky to find anything. As I mentioned earlier, the only pairs of Pokemon from the same evolutionary line that are primed together are Ivysaur and Venusaur, Nidoran female and Nidoqueen, and Slowpoke and Slowking. Slowpoke and Slowking were never gonna appear together, as their dex numbers are way too high. Although Nidoran female and Nidoqueen do at number 899, were dear. But what about cases where a prime Pokemon would be on the same team as another Pokemon it's related to, but which is much further in the Pokédex and isn't a prime Pokemon? Well, that unfortunately never happened. It was always unlikely, but I had hoped against hope that it might happen. But it just didn't. Not for related Pokemon anyway. Because as I was going through, something special happened. I was going through the Pokemon and I reached Toedscool, number 948, and I saw that its prime factors were 2, 2, 3, and 79. And something sparked in my brain. Wait, wasn't Tentacruel's number 79? It was definitely 70 something. And so I quickly went to check and 73. Damn it, that would have been so cool, pun intended. Even though they aren't related, Toedscool is based on Tentacool, and so if Toedscool had been on the prime team for Toedscool, it would have been awesome. Then I went to check Toedscool's prime factorization, 13 times 73. Toedscool has Tentacruel on its prime party, and I think that is just awesome. I mean, it also has Weedle, but you can't win them all. I think it's also interesting to see where certain generations pop up later in prime teams. For example, the first Pokemon that has a Generation 2 Pokemon in its prime team is Illumise, which has a Typhlosion with it, as well as an Ivysaur. Actually, all the teams I'm about to mention have an Ivysaur on them because the first time any prime Pokemon pops up again is when multiplied by 2. The first time a Gen 3 Pokemon turns up is Blaziken on Simisear's team, and for Gen 4 it's Mimikyu with Torterra. Gen 5 first turns up with Pignite on Baxcalibur's team, but Gen 5 is more significant for being the very last generation where any of its Pokemon are on later teams, owing to the fact that Gen 6's first prime goes to Fennekin at number 653, and we have yet to hit the 1306th Pokemon. So Gen 5 only has 2 more Pokemon who turn up again. Samurott is on Iron Valiant's team, and then the very last Pokemon to appear on a later team is Purloin, along with Archualodon. Obviously, this will not stay true forever, but for now it is. Now, as cool as this is, there are some teams that are impossible to actually use. Any team up to Melmetal in Gen 7 is perfectly fine, but from Gen 8 we had Dexit, and that means that not every team is valid. An example is Clobbopus. Clobbopus has existed since Sword and Shield, a game where Victreebel, which should be in its prime team, does not exist. And while Victreebel is in Scarlet and Violet, Clobbopus isn't. It's a bit disappointing that these invalid teams exist, but it's to be expected, I guess. At least it doesn't happen too frequently, and at some point it's very likely the two Pokemon will coexist, so someday you Clobbopus fans can beat a game using its prime factors. I wanted to end this video by going through a few notable Pokemon and what their prime Pokemon teams would be. So, starting with Pikachu. As 25 is a square number, it was actually really easy to figure out. A prime Pokemon team for Pikachu would consist of itself and 2 Charmeleon. Next, let's discuss Mew, the ancestor of all Pokemon. But I'm getting some real chicken and egg vibes here because Mew has to come from somewhere, and my agnostic self isn't convinced the answer is just Arceus. Well, as it happens, Mew is just a Pokemon that seemed to appear from nowhere, as 151 is prime and thus it's all alone. And we all know how rare it is, so given that, what if you wanted to create your own Mewtwo? Well, all you need is an Ivysaur, a Venusaur, and a Charmeleon. Huh, who'd have thought? Well, what about Arceus? Apparently a Pidgeotto and a Nidoran female are its equivalent. I also thought it would be fun to consider Type Null, as it's meant to be a Chimera created in the image of Arceus, and its prime team would be 2 Ivysaur and a Yanma. Silvally is a prime, however. I wanted to talk about a few particularly popular Pokemon, mainly Greninja and Lucario, not only because they came first and second respectively in the Pokemon of the Year poll, but also because Lucario is my favourite Pokemon. First though, Greninja. It actually gets a relatively diverse team of Ivysaur, Squirtle and Parasect. Not one of our 5 unique Pokemon teams, but 4 isn't bad. Lucario meanwhile gets 6 Ivysaur and a Squirtle. Was really hoping for more from a boy, although I do think it's cool how Riolu gets access to Venusaur and Dragonite. And finally, our last Pokemon, Petrarunt, number 1025. Its team would include 2 Charmeleon and a Zubat. It absolutely pulls its weight in that team. There are so many awesome teams I could talk about here, but I have to end somewhere. I really like the idea of using a random number generator to choose a team to use, and that's exactly what I did with Leafeon in the background of this video. I'm going to include the spreadsheet so that you can check it yourself if you want to. Please let me know if there's any mistakes, I really hope there's not. Let me know in the comments what your favourite Pokemon is and what their prime party would be, or maybe if you yourself end up doing a run using one of these teams. And until next time, see ya!